The crystalline halls of Nexus Prime hummed with alien voices, each species adding their own discordant note to the cacophony of judgment. Ambassador Jinho Kim stood before the towering assembly of the Galactic Council, his dark suit a stark contrast to the shimmering robes and chitinous armor of the beings who would decide humanity's fate. "The motion has been deliberated," announced Council Prime Veltar, her 6 eyes focusing on the lone human representative, the species known. "As humanity has been deemed incompatible with galactic civilization." Ginho's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Around him, holographic displays showed the evidence: human expansion into contested territories, the aggressive defense of their colonies, the refusal to submit to the Council's authority structure that had governed the galaxy for millennia. The evidence painted a damning picture. 3 months ago, human colonists had refused to evacuate a mineral-rich moon that the Viridian Empire claimed as ancestral territory. When Viridian ships arrived to enforce the evacuation, human defense fleets had engaged them in battle. The humans won, but the victory came at a cost that echoed through the galaxy. "Your species fights when others would negotiate," continued Prime Veltar, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "You take what you want instead of asking permission. You expand without regard for established boundaries." Jinho finally spoke, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was hearing. "We defend our people and our homes. Is that not what any species would do?" A low rumble of disapproval swept through the chamber. The Thorokian representative, a massive creature whose species had once been warriors themselves, leaned forward. "Other species learn to compromise. Humans only know how to fight." "That is not true," Jinho replied, but his words were lost in the growing murmur of agreement from the assembled aliens. He had been sent here to negotiate, to find a way for humanity to coexist with the galactic community. Instead, he was watching his species being sentenced. The holographic displays shifted, showing more evidence. Human traders who had broken established trade routes to find faster shipping lanes. Human scientists who had ignored quarantine protocols to study dangerous alien artifacts. Human diplomats who had walked out of peace talks when they disagreed. With the terms, each incident viewed alone might have been forgiven. Together, they painted a picture of a species that refused to follow the rules that had kept the galaxy stable for thousands of years. "The pattern is clear," announced Counselor Zethmar, her crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into rainbow patterns. "Humans do not understand cooperation. They only understand dominance." Jinho looked around the chamber, seeing the faces of beings from hundreds of different worlds. Some looked sad, others angry, but all of them had reached the same conclusion. Humanity was a threat that needed to be contained. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Prime Veltar's expression might have been sympathetic if she had been human. "Complete isolation. Your species will be confined to your home system. A barrier will be constructed to prevent any human ships from leaving and any galactic vessels from entering." The words hit Jinho like a physical blow. Complete isolation meant no trade, no communication, no contact with the vast community of species that populated the galaxy. It meant humanity would be alone, cut off from the knowledge and resources that had helped them spread to the stars. "Would sentence an entire species to prison because we refuse to bow to your authority?" Jinho's voice carried a note of disbelief. "We would protect the galaxy from a species that cannot learn to coexist," Veltar replied firmly. "The decision is final. You have 7 standard days to withdraw all human personnel and assets from beyond your system's boundaries." Round the chamber, the representatives nodded in agreement. The vote had been unanimous. Every species in the galaxy had agreed that humanity was too dangerous to be allowed to roam free. Jinho stood in silence for a long moment, processing the enormity of what had just happened. Through the vast windows of Nexus Prime, he could see the assembled fleet that would enforce the quarantine. Hundreds of ships from dozens of species, all united in their desire to keep humanity contained. "I need to contact Earth," he said quietly. "Of course," Prime Veltar replied. "Give them our regards." As Jinho walked toward the communication chambers, he passed groups of alien delegates discussing the technical details of the barrier. They spoke of energy fields and dimensional locks, of technologies that would make escape impossible. They were confident they had solved the human problem permanently. But as he reached the quantum communicator, Jinho found himself thinking about the history of his species. Humans had always been at their best when facing impossible odds. They had crossed oceans when others said it could not be done. They had reached for the stars when their own planet seemed too small. They had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that should have destroyed them. The galaxy expected humanity to accept defeat, to quietly fade away behind their barrier. They saw isolation as punishment. As the end of human ambition, they were about to learn how wrong they could be. President Hyjin Park stood at the observation deck of the International Space Station, watching as the last transport ship from the Proxima Centauri colony docked with the emergency fleet. The evacuation had been completed with typical human efficiency. Every person, every piece of critical equipment, every scrap of data brought home before the barrier activated. Madam President, came the voice of Defense Minister Su-Min Lee. Through her CUM unit, the Council fleet is moving into position. Our long-range sensors show barrier generators being deployed at the heliopause. Hyjin nodded grimly. Around her, the vast array of screens showed the controlled chaos of humanity's greatest logistical achievement. In just 6 days, they had evacuated 17 colonies, consolidated their entire interstellar presence, and prepared for what most species would consider a death sentence. "How long until activation?" she asked. 14 hours, ma'am." The reinforced glass, she could see the emergency session of the United Nations in progress on the surface below. Representatives from every nation, every major corporation, every research institution were hammering out humanity's response to galactic exile. The door behind her slid open, and Admiral Teo N. Cho entered, his weathered face showing the strain. "Of the past week, the fleet commanders are ready for your address, Madam President." Hyjin turned from the window, her expression hardening with resolve. The weight of leading humanity through its darkest hour pressed down on her shoulders. But she had been preparing for this moment since the first reports came back from Nexus Prime. "Admiral, tell me honestly," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "What do our military analysts think our chances are?" Cho's face was grim. "If we try to fight the barrier with conventional weapons, 0. The energy output required would be beyond our current capabilities, but—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "If we approach this differently, if we think of it as a problem to solve rather than a wall to break down, then maybe we have a chance." The screens around them flickered with incoming data. Reports from the evacuation fleet showed the massive scale of the operation. Entire cities had been dismantled and loaded onto transport ships. Research facilities had been moved piece by piece. Even the orbital manufacturing stations had been broken down and brought home. "The Koreans from the Kepler colony brought something interesting," Cho continued. "Dr. Minasong's team had been working on dimensional phase technology. They think the barrier might have weaknesses we can exploit." Hyjin felt a spark of hope. "What kind of weaknesses?" "The barrier works by creating a wall in normal space. But if we can figure out how to move through other dimensions, we might be able to bypass it entirely." Cho pulled up a holographic display showing complex mathematical equations. "It would take years to develop, maybe decades. But it's possible." Round them, the controlled chaos of the evacuation continued. Ships docked and departed in precise patterns, their crews working with the efficiency that had always defined human space operations. But there was something different in the air now, something that hadn't been there during peacetime. "Something else," Cho said quietly. "The evacuation has done something unexpected. For the first time in human history, every person, every resource, every piece of knowledge is in one place. The Chinese scientists are working with American engineers. Russian physicists are sharing data with Indian mathematicians. And barriers between nations are breaking down." Hyjin looked at the screens showing the emergency UN session. Representatives who had been arguing about trade disputes and territorial rights just weeks ago were now working together to plan humanity's survival. The common threat had accomplished what centuries of diplomacy had failed to do. "Patch me through to every ship, every station, every settlement in the system," she said. Minutes later, her image appeared on screens throughout human space. Behind her, Earth turned slowly in its ancient dance, blue and green and defiant against the star-filled void. "My fellow humans," she began, her voice carrying across the void to millions of listeners. "Today marks the end of one chapter in human history and the beginning of another. The galaxy has chosen to abandon us, believing that by cutting us off from their civilization, they have sentenced us to failure." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle across the solar system. "They are wrong. By what others allow us to do, we're the children of explorers who crossed unknown oceans, of inventors who split the atom, of dreamers who reached for the stars when others said it was impossible. This barrier they're building around us is not our prison, it is our workshop." On screens throughout the system, humans watched their leader with growing understanding. The fear that had gripped them since the announcement was beginning to transform into something else. Determination, purpose, unity. "We will not just survive this exile," Hyjin continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We will use it to become something greater than we ever imagined. When we finally break free from this barrier, we will show the galaxy what humanity becomes when it has nothing left to lose and everything to prove." 12 hours later, the barrier activated. A shimmering wall of energy sealed the solar system from the rest of the galaxy. The alien fleet withdrew, satisfied that the human problem was solved. But they didn't see the burst of activity that erupted across human space as soon as they left. Research stations began sharing data at unprecedented rates. Military and civilian technologies merged in ways that had never been attempted before. The old competition between nations became cooperation between partners. The workshop was open, and humanity was ready to build something the galaxy had never seen. 20-5 years later, Dr. Sa Young-han adjusted the quantum resonance field. For the 1000th time, her fingers dancing across controls that hadn't existed when humanity was first quarantined. Around her, the Deep Space Research Station hummed with energy that would have been unimaginable to the engineers who built humanity's first starships. "Field stability at 97%, reported her assistant, Dr. Wujin Nam, his eyes never leaving the cascade of data streaming across his displays. "Harmonics are almost perfect." So Young smiled grimly. "Okay, almost perfect wasn't good enough. Not when they were this close to cracking the barrier that had held humanity prisoner for over 2 decades. Through the station's viewports, she could see the evidence of humanity's transformation. Where once there had been a handful of research stations scattered through the system, now there were thousands. The asteroid belt had been converted into a massive industrial complex. Mars hosted cities that dwarfed anything that had existed. Before the quarantine, even the outer planets had been terraformed into research facilities and testing grounds. Dr. Han came a voice over the intercom. "You have a priority call from Earth Command." She accepted the connection, and the face of Admiral Young-Ho Kong appeared on her screen. His hair had gone gray during the quarantine years, but his eyes burned with the same intensity that had driven humanity's greatest leap forward. "Saw Young," he said, without preamble. "How close are we?" "The dimensional phase technology is ready for full-scale testing," she replied. "We've successfully phased small objects through the barrier matrix. The theory is sound." "Theory won't help us when we need to move entire fleets," the Admiral pointed out. "The Council has been monitoring our communications. They know we're up to something." So Young nodded. The eavesdropping had been expected. What the Council didn't know was that humanity had been feeding them carefully curated information for years, allowing them to believe the quarantine was working exactly as intended. The transformation had been gradual at first. In the early years after the barrier activation, humanity had struggled with the loss of interstellar trade and resources. Food shortages had been common. Energy rationing had become a way of life. Many had wondered if the Council had been right. If humanity was doomed to slowly fade away behind their energy prison. But something unexpected had happened. The crisis had forced every human institution to work together in ways that had never been possible before. The old competition between nations had transformed into cooperation between partners. Scientists from different countries shared their research freely. Military technology was adapted for civilian use. Corporate secrets became public knowledge when they could help solve common problems. The breakthrough came when we stopped thinking like separate countries, So-young explained. To the Admiral? The Korean team's dimensional research combined with German engineering and Japanese manufacturing couldn't have done it alone. Young-ho nodded approvingly. He'd been part of the original planning committee that had reorganized human society. After the quarantine, the old way of doing things simply hadn't worked when survival was at stake. "Show me the test results," he said. So-young activated a holographic display showing the previous week's experiments. Small objects had been successfully phased through the barrier using dimensional shifting technology. The process was still energy-intensive and required precise timing, but it worked. "We can phase objects up to the size of a shuttle," she explained. "The power requirements increase exponentially with size, but our fusion reactors can handle it. The real challenge is maintaining dimensional stability over long distances." The Admiral studied the data carefully. "What about living tissue? Can we safely transport people?" "The biological tests have been successful," So-young replied. "We've transported lab animals through small barrier sections with no adverse effects. The dimensional field doesn't seem to interfere with organic matter." Through the viewport, she could see one of the massive construction platforms working on the next generation of human starships. These vessels were unlike anything that had existed before the quarantine. They were designed not just to travel through space, but to slip between dimensions when necessary. "The Council thinks we're beaten," Young-ho said quietly. "Their latest intelligence reports suggest they believe we've accepted our fate. Some of them are even talking about lifting the quarantine in another century or two, once they think we've learned our lesson." So-young allowed herself a small smile. The Council's arrogance had been humanity's greatest advantage. They had assumed that isolation would break human spirit, that being cut off from galactic civilization would force humanity to become more compliant. Instead, it had freed humanity to become something entirely new. "The test is scheduled for tomorrow," she said. "If successful, we'll be ready for the next phase." After the call ended, So-young returned to her work. Around her, the station continued its quiet revolution. The barrier hadn't just contained humanity, it had forced them to push the boundaries of what was possible with the resources of a single solar system. They had developed faster than light, communication that could penetrate the barrier. They had created energy manipulation technology that surpassed anything in known galactic civilization. They had designed ships that could exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Most importantly, they had learned to work together as a single species with a unified purpose. The next morning, So-young stood in the observation deck of the test facility, watching as the prototype vessel approached the barrier. The ship was small, barely larger than a shuttle, but it represented decades of human innovation and determination. "Initiating phase sequence," announced the test pilot, Commander Minho Park. "Dimensional fields are stable." The ship began to shimmer, its outline becoming unclear as it slipped between layers of reality. For a moment, it seemed to disappear entirely. Then it was through. The barrier that had held humanity for 25 years was no longer unbreakable. The first sign of change came to the outer rim world of Kepler 4b, where the Zephyrian colonies had been struggling with a plague that had already claimed millions of lives. The medical ships that appeared without warning in their system bore no familiar markings. But their design was unmistakably purposeful. Governor Thixali watched from her command center as the unknown vessels requested permission to dock. "Who are they?" she asked her aide. "Unknown, Governor. They appeared 3 hours ago, seemingly from nowhere. They're requesting permission to provide medical assistance." "Medical assistance?" Thixali's four eyes widened in surprise. "What species offers aid to strangers?" The answer came when the airlock opened and Commander Ji-hoon Seo stepped aboard the Zephyrian station. He was unmistakably human, but his uniform and equipment were unlike anything the galaxy had seen. "I'm Commander Seo of the Earth Medical Corps," he said, his translation device rendering his words in perfect Zephyrian. "We understand you're dealing with a biological crisis. We'd like to help." Thixali stared at him in shock. "Human, but the quarantine has been lifted," Juhan replied simply. "We've brought medical supplies and research data that should help with your plague. No payment required. Within hours, human medical teams were working alongside Zephyrian doctors. Their advanced equipment and revolutionary treatment methods saving lives that had been considered lost. The cure they brought didn't just treat the symptoms, it eliminated the plague entirely. The Zephyrian medical chief, Dr. Kexton, watched in amazement as the human devices worked. It's technology. He said to Jihuan, "It's far beyond anything we've seen." "How did you develop it?" Jihuan smiled as he calibrated. "Another healing device. We had time to think. 25 years of thinking, actually. When you can't expand outward, you expand inward. We learned to do more with less." The medical scanners the humans used could identify diseases at the molecular level. Their treatment devices could repair cellular damage that other species considered permanent. Most surprising of all, they had developed cures for illnesses that the galactic medical community had given up on centuries ago. "We studied every biological sample we had collected before the quarantine," Schwann explained as they watched patients recover at impossible speeds. "We mapped every disease, every genetic variation, every possible treatment. We had nothing else to do but become really good at helping people." Similar scenes were playing out across the galaxy. On the industrial world of Vega Prime, human engineering teams arrived to fix the massive manufacturing failures that had been crippling the planet's economy. The humans brought new tools and techniques that solve problems the vegans had struggled with for decades. "Your fusion reactors are running at 30% efficiency," explained engineer Haewon Kim to the amazed vegan factory managers. "With these modifications, we can get them up to 90%. The work will take 3 days." The vegans had been trying to fix those same reactors for 5 years. They watched in disbelief as the humans worked with tools that seemed to bend reality itself. Metal was shaped without heat. Components were assembled with impossible precision. Problems that had seemed unsolvable were fixed with casual efficiency. On the trade routes between star systems, human merchant ships began appearing with cargo holds that defied physics. They carried goods that other species needed but couldn't produce efficiently. They offered fair prices and reliable delivery schedules that put the established trading guilds to shame. Gapped. Captain Yunji Park of the merchant vessel New Horizons smiled as she negotiated with a Thorokian trade representative. "We can deliver those medical supplies to your outer colonies in half the time it would take your regular carriers. No advance payment required." The Thorokian's massive frame shifted uncomfortably. "How is this possible? Our fastest ships take months to reach those systems." "We've learned some new tricks," Yunji replied diplomatically. She didn't mention that her ship could slip between dimensions to bypass the normal limitations of space travel. That particular secret wasn't ready to be shared yet. At the Galactic Council chambers on Nexus Prime, the emergency session had been running for 6 hours. Council Prime Veltar's normally calm demeanor had cracked under the weight of reports flooding in from across the galaxy. "The barrier is still active," insisted Technical Advisor Morden, his tentacles writhing with confusion. "Our sensors show no breach in the containment field." "Then explain to me how human ships are appearing in every sector of the galaxy," Veltar replied coldly. "How are they providing aid to species they've never encountered before?" The reports kept coming. Humans had solved the water shortage on Kepler 186f. They had repaired the damaged atmosphere processors on New Rigel. They had even mediated a territorial dispute between two species that had been fighting for centuries. "They're not asking for anything in return," reported Counselor Zethmar, her crystalline form reflecting the chamber's light in nervous patterns. "They provide aid, they solve problems, and then they leave. They're not trying to establish trade, agreements, or political alliances." The answer came from an unexpected source. The main viewing screen activated, showing the face of Admiral Jaesoon Kim, now commanding humanity's first contact operations. "Honored Council," he said, his tone respectful but confident. "I believe we need to talk." The chamber fell silent. Finally, Veltar found her voice. "How are you? How is this possible?" "The barrier you built was indeed impressive," Jaesoon acknowledged. "But it assumed that matter and energy could only move through normal space. We've learned to work in other dimensions." The implications hit the Council like a physical blow. The quarantine hadn't contained humanity, had given them the freedom to surpass galactic civilization entirely. What do you want? Veltar asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. To help, Jae-sung replied simply. We've brought solutions to problems that have plagued the galaxy for centuries, offering them freely because that's what neighbors do. Round the chamber, council members exchanged worried glances. The species they had exiled now held the power to transform galactic civilization. The question was what humanity would do with that power. 1 year later, same crystalline halls of Nexus Prime witnessed a very different kind of gathering. Ambassador Dae-yoon, Chun Jin-ho's daughter, now representing humanity's formal return to galactic politics, stood before the assembled council. But this time she wasn't alone. Behind her sat representatives from over 40 species, all of whom had benefited from humanity's technological gifts. The motion before us today announced Council Prime Veltar, her voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there during humanity's exile. Is the proposal to restructure the Galactic Council leadership? Do-yoon rose smoothly, her movements confident, in a way that her father's had never been allowed to be. The past year had changed everything. Human-developed medical technology had eliminated 17 different plagues across the galaxy. Human engineering had restored failing star systems to habitability. Human diplomacy had resolved conflicts that had raged for centuries. Honored Council, she began, humanity doesn't seek to dominate or control. We've learned something during our isolation that we'd like to share with the galaxy. She activated a holographic display showing the transformation of human space during the quarantine years. The crowded industrial complexes, the thriving research stations, the unified civilization that had emerged from what was supposed to be their imprisonment. You gave us exactly what we needed, Dae-yoon continued. You forced us to look inward, to find solutions without external resources, to work together without the luxury of escape. You made us stronger by trying to make us weaker.
Around the chamber,
The alien representatives shifted uncomfortably. The irony wasn't lost on them. Their attempt to contain humanity's supposed aggression had created something far more powerful than they had ever imagined. The holographic display shifted. The results of humanity's return to galactic affairs. The Andromedon trade crisis had been solved within weeks of human involvement. The resource wars in the Outer Rim had ended when humans provided unlimited energy technology. Ancient conflicts between species had been resolved through human mediation. We spent 25 years learning how to solve problems, Dae-yoon explained. Not just our own problems, but any problem. When you're trapped in a small space with limited resources, you either learn to make things work or you die. We chose to make things work, Counselor Thurok. The massive being who had once been humanity's harshest critic stood slowly. His voice carried a note of resignation that hadn't been there before. What you're proposing would fundamentally change how the galaxy operates. Yes, Dae-yoon agreed simply. The current system has maintained stability, but it hasn't solved. The underlying problems, species still fight over resources that could be shared, planets still suffer from diseases that could be cured, entire star systems fail because no one has the technology to fix them. The display showed comparative data from before and after human intervention. Mortality rates had dropped across dozens of worlds. Economic efficiency had increased by factors that seemed impossible. Even the most pessimistic projections showed that human involvement had improved life for billions of beings. But what do you want in return? Asked Counselor Zethmar, her crystalline form reflecting nervous patterns. No species gives such gifts without expecting something back. Dae-yoon smiled, and for a moment she looked remarkably like her father. We want exactly what we've always wanted. We want to be left alone to help people. We want to solve problems without having to ask permission first. We want to make the galaxy a better place for everyone. The chamber fell silent. The request was so simple, yet so fundamentally different from how galactic politics had always worked. The Council had always been about controlling and limiting, about maintaining balance through restrictions and regulations. Humanity was proposing something entirely different. You're asking us to trust you, Veltar said finally. To give you the freedom to act without oversight, to intervene in galactic affairs without authorization. We're asking you to judge us by our actions, Dayun replied. For the past year, we've had that freedom. Has any species suffered because of it? Has any world been harmed by our intervention? The representatives looked around the chamber, but no one could point to a single instance where human involvement had made things worse. If anything, the galaxy had become more prosperous and peaceful than it had been in centuries. The vote is before you, Dayun continued. You can maintain the current system with all its limitations and problems. Or you can trust humanity to help coordinate galactic development, to share our innovations freely, to work with every species to reach their potential. The voting process took hours, but the result was inevitable. Species after species stood to announce their support for the new paradigm. The Zephyrians, whose plague had been cured by human medicine. The Vegans, whose industrial failures had been solved by human engineering. Even former enemies who had been brought together by human diplomacy. When the final tally was announced, the vote was unanimous. It's not because the Council feared humanity's power, but because they had experienced humanity's generosity. As the session ended, Yoon stood at the same observation deck where her father had once watched the fleet deploy to quarantine humanity. Now that same space was filled with ships from dozens of species, all working together under human coordination. Her communicator chimed with a message from Earth. It was simple and direct. They said it was over. We said it had just begun. History. We'll remember who was right. Do-yoon smiled, watching as the first joint species exploration fleet prepared to depart for unknown regions of the galaxy. The quarantine that was supposed to end humanity's story had instead become the beginning of something entirely new. The galaxy had tried to contain humanity's potential. Instead, they had unleashed it, and now, for the first time in galactic history, every species would have the chance to reach for the stars together.